You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
From Mamma Mia, you're listening to No Filter. I'm Mia Freedman, and I always wanted to be a cheerleader. It looked so fun. Pom-poms and the cute costumes, dancing. I never managed it though. Went into media instead, and I changed my aspirations, my hopes, my dreams. But like seemingly everyone else on the planet recently, I binged the Netflix show America's Sweethearts, the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders, which, if you weren't watching it, followed the 2023 squad of 36 cheerleaders and how it was formed in a 7-part documentary series. From the cutthroat tryouts to the grueling practices and the big game performances and the private lives of some of the cheerleaders, it is one of the most famous cheerleading squad, if not the most famous cheerleading squad, for one of the most famous football teams in the world. And like so many people, I watched the series with a mix of awe and kind of shock. I was awed by the talent and the skill of these women. I mean, those jump splits, ouch. They really are athletes. But I was shocked at the level of scrutiny they're under, at the wildly high standards that they try so hard to meet, standards about their bodies and their weight, their personalities, their morality and their behaviour on and off the field. We catch a few glimpses of the very high costs of being a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader. But did you get the sense, I know I did, that we were really only seeing the tip of the iceberg? A lot of things were left unsaid in that documentary series. When it comes to things like injuries and the issues around pay, the sexual exploitation, and the deep, deep body image issues that arise in environments that are all about a kind of Barbie doll look. It's not that these women aren't intelligent and amazing. They absolutely are. But my guest today knows a whole lot more. Sarah Hepola is the expert on all things Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. You might have seen her in the Netflix show. She also hosted her own podcast years earlier. It was called America's Girls, and that also was a documentary about the cheerleaders, but it went a whole lot deeper and really portrayed what goes on behind the glossy veneer that we saw on our screens. She is a true Texan to boot, so she knows of what she speaks. And it is so much more jaw-dropping than what we all saw on Netflix. So put your pom-poms together and do a jump split. Careful of your hips. Here's Sarah Hepola. You recently wrote for the Dallas Morning News about the Netflix show. The show's 7 episodes can't possibly tackle all the cheerleaders' many controversies: fair pay, sexual exploitation, injuries, body image. These topics are glanced upon but never fully confronted. As someone who has become such an expert on the cheerleaders, on Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, what did you think when you watched the documentary?
It's the perfect starter kit to kind of introduce it to a mass audience. And the show has done incredibly well. I mean, the day that I was writing about it for the Dallas Morning News, it was #1 on Netflix here in America. And I think it's been #1 in Canada and Australia and maybe even Britain.
Yeah.
I've gotten tons of emails and people want to talk about these characters. Why did Victoria do this? Or what is Kelly really like? Or whatever it is that sort of, in that reality TV show way of sparking the like psychological profiler inside your brain that wants to untangle everything. So it definitely does that. It gives you all this candy to work with. And then of course there's just the eye candy of the thing itself. It's nice that all these different things are there because the truth is, as frivolous as it sounds, cheerleaders in Dallas, Texas. I know, I get it. It's actually like a really profound story about women and their place in society, moving from the sidelines into something more like center stage. It's a group that is shaped by women for the better and worse, because women can be the most cruel to each other. So it's a story about beauty and image and value and all these things that kind of go deep in the Western psyche.
And looking really at the role of women in pop culture and how that changed and attitudes to women and sexuality, which is something that your podcast explored so much more than the Netflix show. You start in America's Girls at the beginning in 1972, but I want to jump ahead to the point where Jerry Jones bought the Dallas Cowboys. Can you tell me when that was and what was the state of play of the DCC when he bought them?
Well, it was 1989. You know, and what you should know is that the Dallas Cowboys were an institution. You know, it was as sacred as the oldest church in town, but they were not a winning team. They'd had several long losing seasons and they were losing money. And this swaggering outlaw, this Arkansas oil man named Jerry Jones, nobody had ever heard of him. And I mean, he just basically came onto the chessboard and just knocked over all the pieces. You know, he fires Tom Landry, the legendary coach. He pushes out Tex Schramm, the general manager that had been there from the beginning and built the entire brand, a marketing genius. And it's like Dallas is gutted, right? Everybody hates him. And, you know, your question was about what were the cheerleaders like at the time. You know, the cheerleaders had been an institution, but they were also somewhat stuck in a rut. But the big thing about the cheerleaders, if you were in Dallas or if you followed them a little closely, was you knew they never date the football players. Well, this is the line, okay? This is the company line. Now, of course, did they date the football players? I'm sure some of them did. But the company line was, they are never to date the football players. They are innocent girls next door. You know, there is a rule book about the size of the old phone books that, you know, they used to get in the 80s and 90s. It's something called an indoctrination ceremony. It would basically be like your best behavior, how to eat, how to dress, how to answer questions. And I think for the modern minds, I think for the modern woman, this is a million paper cuts. It's like, you know, don't tell me how to dress. Don't tell me how to eat, you know, because we are so steeped in a sort of, you know, I'll do it my own way. Thank you very much. However, I just want to say that part of what they saw their value as being was a kind of finishing school for young girls that had grown up on farms, young girls that wanted access to a larger life. And part of that access was going to require dressing right, eating right. I mean, it's a Pretty Woman story. It's a Cinderella story. You know, that if you go from X to Y, and if you want to be at Y, you're going to need to learn the ropes. And this was a place that, for free, would teach you the ropes into a kind of more established adulthood.
And it's interesting that you say that, because what the Netflix show made clear, and of course your podcast, is that these women, as is so often the case, just because they're pretty and can dance and are attractive doesn't mean they're not also intelligent, ambitious, complex, layered, nuanced, interesting, multidimensional people. From Anisha, who is the orthodontist, to, you know, all the girls who have marketing degrees and are doing all sorts of other things in nursing and all kinds of roles. But I want to drill down on this idea of the rules, because you mentioned it. I mean, that was something that came up a lot, this idea of the rules, because it seems like there's a part of the rules which is about appearance, but there are also rules that are more about morality and this idea of what a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader needs to represent as a woman. And I want to ask you about the fraternization rule, because what was missing from me in the Netflix thing was the voice of the players. What do the players think of the DCC, and why is that fraternization rule there? Like, what's the history of it? Because I know that it's the same not just for DCC, but it's even for cheerleaders in Australia on pretty much every team. There is a no fraternization rule between the cheer squad and the players. Why is that?
The no fraternization rule was in place since 1972 when they first became a professional cheerleading squad. Before then, they had used like high school girls. It took me a while to figure out that I'm pretty sure it came from Coach Landry, who was the football coach, because basically if you introduced a bunch of really beautiful young women onto the field of football players, their wives were going to freak out.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. It's about
it was
the
to please
wives
the
of the
wives.
players.
It was, yeah.
Okay. It never made sense to me because I'm like, is it to protect the virtue of the cheerleaders? Is it to protect the players from not being able to control themselves? And
it's not control themselves, it's distraction. I mean, I don't think they cared about the players controlling themselves because there's plenty of crazy stories that suggest they did not. What they cared about was distraction on the field. And what they also cared about was wives showing up to Coach Landry's office and banging on the door and saying, why the hell are there, girls in crop tops on the side of this field where my husband is working? And in that Netflix series, one of the cheerleaders is very religious.
Yes.
And I was watching it with a group of people, and one of the girls said, I guess that's a little unusual. And I was like, oh, no, that's very on brand.
Speak to that.
It is a very Christian organization. And I think maybe not so much now, but like through the 70s and 80s, it touted itself as a Christian organization. And it held to those virtues, meaning that you are protecting the virtue of a woman, and you or I may blanch at that. We may not like the sound of that, but you have to remember that part of what they're doing is, hey, look, the world is going to look at you as less than if you don't present this face. So we're going to help you present this face. Your reputation is not ruined. You don't give this away for momentary whatever. All the reasons that, you could call them rules, you could call them protection, you could call them etiquette. They are rules of behavior. And yes, I think you're correct to see morality in that as well. The no fraternization rule, it just makes sense to me because I also have done stories about cheer squads where there wasn't that rule in place. And some of the nonsense that starts getting, like, I'm not saying that there wasn't nonsense in the Cowboys. There's a ton of nonsense, but to try to control it a little bit, when you are allowed to date each other, think about like what happens when you break up. Think about what happens when somebody gets their heart broken.
I didn't think about it as an office romance gone wrong, potentially.
It's an office romance gone wrong. And, this is your workplace. And there are plenty of places throughout the 70s and 80s that are starting to say, hey, we shouldn't be dating people in the workplace. It runs afoul of people's fantasies about what the Cowboys and cheerleaders would be, because there is this, they never say this explicitly, but there is this like tacit understanding that like, here are the 36 hottest women, and they're the ones that are going to be dating the most amazing players on the field. And like
the
they all
cheerleader
go
and the
out.
captain of the football team, for sure. We grew up on that.
It's an American cliche. It's an American fairy tale, essentially. It's your prince and your princess. And so that rule was in place since 1972, and they were really strict about it. But I will say one thing, which is that the women running the cheerleading squad were strict about it. The coaches weren't really paying attention to it. They don't really care. Like if some quarterback who will go unnamed had a reputation for nosing around the cheerleaders and trying to give his phone number, the coach isn't really going to care. The cheerleader's going to get in trouble. And that's where it becomes really super unfair, right? That's the kind of double standard where the cheerleaders are going like, hey, I don't even want to talk to you. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get in trouble. And the guy's still kind of heat seeking. Now, you asked about the change when Jerry Jones took over. I left that hanging a little bit. I wanted to say that one of the things Jerry Jones did when he came in 89 was he wants to like loosen up the cheerleading squad. He wants to make the uniform sexier. He wants the players to date cheerleaders.
There's a part in the podcast where you talk to someone about how they would be booked for these appearances and go to hospitals and aged care homes. And this girl got a request, one of the team, and it was to go on his private jet.
Yeah.
In uniform. And she was like, hang on a second. And he would bring his friends to cheer rehearsals, to just sit on the sidelines and drink beer and smoke and watch the girls. And he really took advantage of his position, and they suddenly felt exploited, right?
I don't remember who it was that I interviewed that said, it was like it was Christmas and he was opening up all his toys.
Ooh.
And one of his toys was the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders.
Creepy.
And, it was a energetic shift away from the previous ownership. Tex Schramm was the general manager. He loved to swing in good time, but he was old fashioned in that sense that the cheerleaders were like on a pedestal.
He respected them.
Yes, he did. And he didn't go to the practices like ever. Like, I don't think he was interested. Like, one of the things you asked was, what do the football players think of the cheerleaders? I actually think the answer is they mostly don't think about them. My observation with hardcore sports fans is that they also don't care about the cheerleaders. You know, the cheerleaders are obviously introduced in the 70s to court certain male viewership, but one of the interesting twists in the cheerleader storyline is that they begin to mostly appeal to women and gay men because they are dancing and they are shiny, and the pop sexualization of women has become so mundane that sexy women on the sideline is no longer interesting to your armchair viewer, because you could see it anywhere. You could see it on a billboard. You could see it
on your phone, sitting in the stands.
The internet age. But the people that become very fascinated with the cheerleaders are women, and especially young girls who look out on that field and are looking for where they would be. Yeah. And it is a deeply male game. I don't know how you are with sports, but like,
not good.
Basketball, I understand. Hockey, I like. You know, football is so militaristic. It's confusing.
Everything I know about American football is against my will, and thanks to Travis Kelce.
You are in a very large boat with that one.
More of my conversation with Sarah after this break. When you watch the show, it seems like the cheerleaders are the main event, right? And it seems like the stands are packed. But when I went on YouTube and looked for more footage, the stands are pretty empty. Like when they perform, it's not everyone cheering and shouting. Most people have probably gone to get a beer. Like, I was really struck by that.
I was struck by that as well. When I finally saw them in person, because I did the podcast during the pandemic. And so even when I went to a game, it was like that weird thing where the stands could only be a quarter full or whatever. So when I finally went back to a game, I was really shocked at how little people were paying attention to them. They dance for the entire game pretty much. And they have all this code. I mean, to me, honestly, it just looks like it's like hip, shimmy, 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 shimmy. But it's like formation 533, you know, on the left.
Because they've got like 100 dance routines and it's like routine number 76. Go.
Seriously. No, they've got like 200 routines in their head and they're doing them like, and they are moving the entire time. They are tiny, by the way. Like, they're so little. I thought they were like big because you see them on TV, but they're like, I wouldn't say gymnast size, but like.
Really?
Yeah, they're really small. They're like 5'2" to 5'6" or 5'8". I mean, obviously some of them are taller, but I mean, like, for the most part, they're
not Amazons, which is how they sort of come across.
I thought they were Amazons.
Like supermodels. I
really did.
Yeah.
And you should see their uniforms hanging on a hanger. Honestly, it looks like toddler clothing. It's like tiny little white shorts. I remember when I first started the podcast, I'm just going to tell you, this is so embarrassing. When I first started the podcast, I was like, I'm going to diet. And for the end of the podcast, I'm going to debut my Dallas Cowboys cheerleader uniform. Like, I was like trying to lose weight, working out, like going to bar class all the time. And I ordered like a fake one online. And I put it on and I was like, I will never show this in public. Like, I will never, ever. It looked so bad on me. Like, and look, I'm not the target demographic for cheerleaders either in body size or in age. But I mean, like, I thought I had a hope, right? You know, I thought I had a small hope. And it was just like, no freaking way.
Well, let's talk about that. I want to ask you about that. Can you explain the wait list?
Yeah, the wait list dates back to the 70s. A woman named Suzanne Mitchell had taken over and she had a real boot camp mentality. And one of the things she would do was post everybody's weight once a week. You would get weighed at least once a week. When you walked into the dressing room, all your names were listed, and then it would have your weight, and then it would have areas you needed to work on. So it might say hips and thighs, or it might say belly. And Suzanne Mitchell is really the like incredible force that makes them a machine in the 70s and 80s. And she's so much a part of the story of why they became the phenomenon that they did. But she is also like, she scares people. I mean, she would go up to people and grab their ass and say, lose it. And, you know, she would circle jelly rolls on pictures. And, you know, basically everything that the poisoned female psyche does to itself on Instagram or when looking in the mirror, She's the physical embodiment of that. And then the thing that's, I think, so painful about it is that it's also public. When I heard that story about the wait list, I mean, I was cringing a million times. I interviewed somebody, her name is Amber. She was a 90s cheerleader and also a legacy cheerleader. Her mother had cheered as well. Her life revolved around that wait list. When are they going to weigh you? And then if on the days that they're going to weigh you, you have to do all these tricks. Like she would go running in a trash bag. Basically, they're not actual trash bags. They're like wrestling things. And she'd go in the Texas heat.
Made of plastic to sweat
running,
out.
Yeah, to sweat out all this water so that she could make weight. And it's like, make weight. Just that idea is like, it's so wild and arbitrary. First of all, the weight stuff is the part that I have the hardest time with in all of this, because I know how much those girls starve themselves and tweak their body. And I think they do it less now because there isn't quite the scrutiny, but I'm sorry, there is still a scrutiny. And you see that in the character of Victoria, who is somebody who one year she's too heavy, the next year she's too thin. They keep using these coded words
like fuel.
And I'm like, what is fuel? Did she have a gas tank?
But in the Netflix show, it was interesting. And it was so obvious that you could almost see Judy and particularly Kelly. It was almost like they were in a hostage video because they just,
absolutely,
you knew what they wanted to say and you knew how careful they were being about the coded way, exactly as you said, about fuel and about, the only comments they would allow to be broadcast was that saying one girl was too scrawny, but you just knew.
Oh, yeah, right. I know. She's not fueling herself.
She's not
enough.
fueling herself.
You probably remember this moment where it's Judy and she's talking about Victoria and she's like, they're talking about how her weight was up and down and how one year her stamina was really bad. Well, probably because she was starving herself. And instead of saying, oh, that's when she had an eating disorder or whatever, she goes, that's when she was, and then there's this stop and she goes, on her journey to health or something like that. It's something so comical. I do sympathize with her because they have this panopticon. Everything they're saying is going to be viewed a million times, not just by this camera, but by Netflix, but by YouTube, by the morning, talk show people. So they have that in the back of their mind. Interestingly, I spoke to some male viewers of the show, and the hardest part for them was the harsh critiques of women's appearance. They did not like it.
That's encouraging.
It made them very uncomfortable, and I think it summoned, first of all, they've been told not to do that. So they're like, why are you doing that? I'm told not to do that.
Well, it's become countercultural.
Yes, right.
Thank God.
And it summoned the part of them that felt very protective. They were both fathers of daughters. And so it was very uncomfortable. But I defend that. Now, I think there are ways that you do it and you can do it better and worse and stuff, but I do think it is reasonable for them to have very strict standards for both appearance and performance. I don't think any of that is unreasonable. I may quibble about how they go about it, but the idea that they should just loosen up their standards, I mean, that's like saying, well, hey, the Navy SEALs, some people can't do it. Why don't we just make it a little easier for the Navy SEALs?
Yeah, but Sarah, I guess the difference is that's about what you can do, not how you look while you're doing it. And of course, they have the right to decide whatever they want. But as our society has understood the importance of diversity and inclusion, and that having that cookie cutter approach, is there a reason that a size 12 or even a size 10 girl couldn't physically do all of those things? There isn't really. That's just an aesthetic standard that is tradition, or that is the way they
I mean, I guess what I would say is that they get to set the look of their team the same as any other business gets to set the look of their team. Now, there are professional cheerleading squads that have diversified in size. So the classic look of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders is basically your 50s, 60s pinup. It's going to be a long leg, a very narrow waist, and flat
stomach. That's what I couldn't stop looking at. That from the belly button down into their shorts to the pubic bone, just almost concave. Did girls get cut for putting on weight? Do they still?
I'm sure they do. They've become very mysterious about how they handle this. I mean, again, no, they don't get cut for weight. They get cut for not fueling properly. I don't know what you're talking about.
Stamina.
They don't have the right nutrition journey. I'm not sure what you mean.
They're on their health journey.
Of course. Yeah, they do. And I wanted to circle back to one point you made, which I thought was a really good one, but I want to fine tune it slightly, which is the idea that, in the Navy SEALs or maybe in football itself, like these are things that you can improve upon yourself. They're not about your appearance.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's true. I don't think there are things, I think there are genetic gifts that Navy SEALs and football players have that nobody else can have. It's out of your hands whether or not you're able to throw a 50-yard spiral. You could try and try and try. The American dream was always that you can become whatever you want to be. And when you have a meritocratic system like this with very, very elite standards, it flies in the face of that. And that's going to make a lot of people mad. And I really understand that. And I think a lot of people think it's not fair. And I think that's true. It's not fair. I also think there's a lot of things in life that are not fair. And so I defend them getting to set the standards where they are within the limits of the law. I think in the 21st century, they have finally brought the idea of eating disorders into the conversation and they talk about it. They might not talk about it with the camera rolling, but I think it's a discussion. They know that that's not good. I think back in the day, there were dieting tips in the rule book that were like, suck on ice. Like literally, like if you're hungry, suck on ice. I mean, crazy stuff.
What were some of the other rules that made your jaw hit the floor?
You could do a whole episode on that. I have a rule book from the 90s. And it is so wild. One of the things that strikes me, it has these talking points for when you talk to press. And so one of the questions is, are the cheerleaders exploited? And the answer is just no. And then one of the questions is, do you ever feel exploited by the uniform? You have like a couple different answers. Yeah. One is, it's an honor to wear the uniform. And another answer is, I never feel sexy. I feel like it's patriotic or something like that. I can't remember what it is. What's interesting is that those talking points have so thoroughly infiltrated the culture that even though I don't think they give those talking points out anymore, they don't have to because the older generation basically mirrors for the younger generation. This is how you speak. One of the really interesting like cognitive disconnects in the cheerleader mindset for me when I met them was that I kept asking them about the sexiness of the uniform and they kept saying it's not sexy. And I was like, what do you mean it's not sexy? And they were like, no, it's like a bathing suit. And I'm like, okay, yeah, right. Well, bathing suits are sexy. And they were like, I just don't think it is. It's like a Wonder Woman costume. To me, what we were getting into at that point, these are 21st century cheerleaders, is you're getting into a world where so much about our culture is kind of sexified and amplified in that way.
It's the air they breathe, the air we all breathe.
It has been removed of what it signals to them.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think, a good Christian woman or a good Southern woman or a good sorority girls or whatever reluctance to embrace sexuality. So it's this very funny thing where you exude sexuality, but you don't embody it off the field.
But you still have to be a fantasy. Like one of the things I thought was interesting is this idea that they have to remove their wedding rings and they can't be in public with their boyfriends or their husbands or their girlfriends. So it's like they're sexy but not sexual.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, it reminds me of boy bands. Boy bands and pop starlets, like they always had to lie about, like back when the glossy magazines were still in control of the narrative. They had to lie about like, oh no, I don't have a girlfriend. I'm mostly looking for a normal girl. The idea was that you will be more marketable. You will be more popular if the girl looking from her bedroom at your portrait on her wall can imagine that she will one day be your girlfriend, wife, whatever. And the cheerleaders are like that as well. They have to cover any tattoos. It used to be tattoos were like an absolute verboten, but now they're so popular, they can't outlaw them entirely. So you have to cover them with like a little patch, no jewelry. I mean, look, no identifying features. Here's the thing that I think is so anathema to the modern mindset. You are not an individual. It is not about you. It is about the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders.
Yeah. You're part of a group. You're a piece of that puzzle. And you saw that when the legacy cheerleaders came back, the former cheerleaders came back. That's what was so moving to me about it is the friendship and because from the outside you would think, oh, they must be really bitchy.
Yeah.
But it's the opposite. Like part of why they all love doing it so much, and that's made clear, it's not just, in the rule book to say it, there's that feeling of sorority, that feeling of sisterhood and doing it with your friends.
I was very skeptical of that for a very long time. And I kept pushing in on all the sides, trying to find, like, I'm sure this is not true. And just like cheerleaders dating players, yes, of course. Has there been bitchery on the squad? Absolutely, 100%.
Does it still happen? Do any of the DCC date players? And if you get caught, do you get cut? You mentioned nonsense before. What kind of nonsense?
So in the 70s, before Suzanne Mitchell takes over, and part of why she has to take over in the way that she does is that the team was on such a winning streak. The cheerleaders were such hot shit, and they were all going out with the players. They were all doing drugs. Sorry, ladies. I know you're my friend. I love the 70s cheerleaders, but there was a lot of drugs on that team.
Yeah.
It was a cocaine time, you know? And so there was just a lot of craziness. And she comes in and like absolutely throws down the law. And it's no more of that. It's no more Mr. Nice Guy. And also you're going to get weighed every week and da-da-da-da. But scroll forward to Jerry Jones. I mean, there's a story about Troy Aikman wanting to date a cheerleader. He had a crush on one of the cover of the swimsuit calendar cheerleader. And he goes to Jerry Jones, and Jerry Jones is like, yeah, I don't care. That's fine. So he goes to the cheerleaders, and they're like, well, that's not okay with us. Like, you can't do that. You know, it's our tradition not to do it. Because now we've gone from Tom Landry is instituting it so the wives don't get mad. But 20 years later, it's like, it's become such a tradition that the women are like, don't do this to us.
They're enforcing those standards.
So the people in charge, one of them is Kelly Finglass, who's still in charge. She goes to this young cheerleader and she says, well, you're going to have to choose Troy Aikman or the cheerleaders. And the young woman says, bye. And she chooses Troy Aikman. She had to leave the cheerleaders. Meanwhile, Troy could have continued to date her. I suspect dated some other cheerleaders. It's this weird double standard. Again, this is the enforcement of women. Like, women keeping other women in line can sometimes be like the most ferocious penalties. But that's why, by the way, those cheerleaders are all super tight, because they are in the foxhole together. All those cheerleaders come into a very high pressure experience that only they understand. And they are living in fear of the two women that determine their fate on that team, Kelly and Judy. And nobody wants to break ranks. And they end up like loving each other and having this incredible closeness.
More of my conversations about the DCC with Sarah Hepola after this break. I want to ask you about pay. What do they get paid? And is it even legal?
They don't like to say what they pay. Our best reporting, which was done by a Dallas reporter named Paige Skinner, is that they get paid now $400 a game plus hourly wages. And that is a very far cry from what they paid into the 90s, which was $15 a game. And when I say $15 a game, you're thinking, did she say $15 an hour and I misheard her?
Yeah.
Did she say $150 a game? No.
$15,000 a game, did she say?
Did she say $15,000 a game? No, it's $15 a game.
And what is a game day? Like, that's like 12 hours, 14 hours of work?
You know, when you consider that you have to put on your makeup, you've got to do your hair, you've got to like get stretched out, you got to get to the stadium 3 hours early. The game itself is 3 hours. Then you've got to meet with fans. I mean, these are entire days. So that's $15. This pay rate stays into the 90s, which is stunning to me. And then it goes up to 50. Thanks. And then it goes up to 200 at some point, and then the lawsuits start happening. So the other question you had was, how is this legal? I actually think it has not been historically. In our last episode, we brought an employment lawyer on to kind of dissect a contract that we were looking at. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but basically with any business practice, you either have independent contractors, in which case you don't have to pay them minimum wage, but you can't tell them what to do or where to go. You don't have control over them. Or you have employees where you get to do all those things. You can tell them standards, you know, you've got to wear this uniform, you got to be here at this time, but you have to pay them a minimum wage. It's got to work out to an hourly minimum wage based on the Fair Labor Standards Act. Well, none of the NFL teams were doing that when it came to their cheerleaders. And it kickstarted a series of lawsuits beginning in 2013 with the Oakland Raiders. That was a class action lawsuit that they won. They won a big settlement for that. And it started to move like a wave over all the professional squads over the next 4, 5, 6 years. But it didn't come without consequences. Pushing back about the pay issue sometimes just made the team itself go, this is too much work, forget it, we're shutting the cheerleaders down. So by advocating for themselves, sometimes the cheerleaders lost their jobs. And it became a very tricky thing.
I imagine that they would have probably been put under a lot of pressure by the other cheerleaders about disloyalty, don't rock the boat, we're just grateful to be here.
Absolutely. So in 2018, I believe, a cheerleader named Erica Wilkins files a wage discrimination suit against the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders. She files it as a class action suit, meaning she wanted other cheerleaders to join her, but they don't. They circled the wagons on social media. The roar from the Cowboys camp itself was just basically like, hey, look, you knew what you were getting into. And she did. But one of the things that I think cheerleaders, and I think this Netflix series makes a lot more clear, and I'm really happy about that, is I think when people first heard about the pay issue, maybe they were outraged, maybe they weren't, but I don't think they had any sense at all what cheerleading involved. I don't think they understood how rigorous it was, how demanding, how talented these women, how many injuries they have. And the injuries part of it was on the down low for a really long time. I mean, I was very glad that Greg included that. I mean, you get this sense through this one cheerleader.
Caroline,
Yeah, Caroline, they do these jump splits and they are really tough on your body. And it's not just that, it's the hair whipping. There's all sorts of like neck and back. They have to like put their bodies out. So there are injuries that are sustained. And, it's this interesting thing. It's the same problem with football where there is concussions. There are these injuries. In the football player's case, they're getting paid. Sometimes big money, not always. I mean, you'd be surprised how like low men on the totem pole in football, they don't get that much. But let's say it's still a hell of a lot more than $400 a game. Should they be allowed to make a bad decision for themselves? Yeah. Basically, I don't care about the concussions. I want to still play this game. Well, I think as a general rule, we've kind of said, yeah, okay, the concussion thing came out. It was supposed to shut down football. It didn't. Football only got bigger.
The women don't even get health insurance. The cheerleaders don't even get health insurance.
Absolutely not. They don't get health insurance. No. And the stories I wish we could tell if cheerleaders would tell them, but I think they're sensitive about it because the brand was always trying to project an image of perfection, is the cheerleaders throughout the 90s and aughts and teens, selling some of their free products just to make rent, going without insurance, sleeping in their car during training camp. This Netflix series, the cheerleaders that we meet stay at the Gaylord Texan, which is a luxury hotel in Grapevine. Well, that's a new thing that they're doing. They didn't used to put people up at the Gaylord. I don't know if that's just for Netflix. I have no idea. But all I can tell you is that for a long time, the cheerleaders had a 1 to 2 month training camp that paid nothing. And they had to just figure out how they were going to pay for themselves. And some of these people don't live in Dallas.
Just
so
for
they're sleeping
honor.
on couches. Wow. They're sleeping in cars. They're sleeping in parking lots. I mean, there are crazy stories. There are crazy stories, especially during those 90s go-go years where they're winning Super Bowls. And those cheerleaders are stepping out of a limousine on the Super Bowl field and they're going home and like they can't pay for their own surgeries and health insurance and they have to borrow money. So that is the contrast that I wish we would see more of. Not because I want to embarrass anybody. I don't think they should be embarrassed. I think those are stories about survivors, scrappers, people that made something
about exploitation because the club's making millions of dollars literally off their backs and their booties.
The Cowboys should be embarrassed. They still don't pay them a living wage. I believe that they could be pioneers in the industry. It is completely within their ability to do this. They have just dug in their heels on this. But the thing is they could set the trend. But what they've done over the last 50 years is to basically tarnish and embarrass their own organization for how poorly they have paid and treated the cheerleaders. Now, a separate issue is that the cheerleaders have often said, I would do it for free, fair and fine. That is still not your legal obligation. Under the law, they should still be paying them more, I believe.
You're not the Lone Ranger there. And I hope they are shamed by this next season. One of the things I learned about in your podcast was the Australian Dallas Cowboy cheerleader. Tell me about Janelle.
Janelle. She became very obsessed with the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. She packed up her bags. I mean, This is wild to me. Back in the day, it was crazy if you came from Oklahoma to Dallas for the training camp. She came from Australia and lands in Dallas and tries out for the team. And I think she makes it, but by like the skin of her teeth, because she's one that didn't have enough nutrition. They kept telling her she was too skinny. And then they see her on the Jumbotron and they really like it. But Janelle's a very interesting story too, because she's on the squad for 5 years. She's a cheerleader favorite. But, and this is the story that is so interesting, because there's always been a very strict no fraternization with any of the staff. But she starts dating Kelly's assistant, who is a woman. And when it's revealed, Kelly, who is not, I mean, you can get a sense of her through this show. Like, that woman can be tough. She is a tough bitch when she wants to be. She loves this story. She uses it on social media to tell a love story about a different generation of cheerleaders. There was a time when it was unthinkable that a cheerleader would date or marry a woman. And now it's just another way of being a cheerleader.
That's a lovely story. Sarah, thank you so much. See, I told you she was the expert. She's like a human museum of the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. Some of the stuff that I learned from Sarah in that interview about the fraternizing, about that story, about the cheerleader who was like, I choose my man over my pom-poms. The pay, and Jerry Jones, he was so creepy in that Netflix show. But one of the things I really didn't understand before this conversation is why these women would work for so little pay. Being a cheerleader for the Dallas Cowboys is really seen as this great honor and this great privilege. And Sarah kind of explained that it's not just about the money for them. But still, even if someone loves what they do and feels really honored and privileged to do it, they should get paid more. So much more. I mean, given the millions of dollars that the players make, and given the fact that the mascot makes about $65,000, these women make about $15,000 a year. And I never got the no fraternization rule before. But of course, it's because of the wives. That makes sense too now. And if you can't get enough of the DCC, I cannot recommend her podcast enough, but we also have done a lot of stories on Mamma Mia about them, including a story about Janelle, the Aussie cheerleader who married the girl of her dreams. I've interviewed Sarah before, actually. You might recognise her name and her voice. She was on No Filter talking about a book called Blackout that was about her long journey to sobriety. So I'll also put a link to that in the show notes if you want to have a listen. This podcast was executive produced by Naima Brown, who's also American, but not from Texas. And I don't know if she wanted to be a cheerleader or not, but I'm glad she's not one because she's amazing on this show. And also Leah Porges, who is the wind beneath our wings. Thanks for listening. I'm Mia Freedman. Go shake your pom-poms.